What if every dish you call American, every plate you've ordered your entire life, every bite you've eaten without a second thought, was actually cooked somewhere else first, by someone who never once got the credit? What if even America's most iconic foods, the ones on every diner menu, on every July 4th table, on every childhood memory you have of summer, trace back to continents America hadn't yet finished mapping when it decided to claim them? What if the greatest food origin lie in the modern world isn't Chinese, isn't French, isn't Italian, it's American? All three are true, and 10 dishes prove it one by one. Hit subscribe right now, because by the end of this, you will never look at your plate the same way again. And that shift starts immediately with item 1. The smoke hits you before anything else does. It doesn't drift. It arrives, thick and volcanic, wrapping around everything within 50 feet like it has somewhere to be. Meat so slow cooked it doesn't need a fork because it's already surrendering, pulled apart by gravity alone, lacquered in a charred sweet bark that smells like something ancient and irreversible is happening deep inside that pit. Most people assume American BBQ is the American South's greatest invention. As southern as red dirt roads, as front porches, as family reunions where somebody always brings too much potato salad. It feels prehistoric. It feels like it was born right there in the Carolina lowlands and never left. But BBQ was never invented in America, not even close. The technique that would become American barbecue was documented in 1526 in Hispaniola, Spanish explorers writing about the Taíno people of the Caribbean who smoked meat over a raised wooden frame they called a barbacoa, a word that simply meant the structure itself. When Spanish colonizers spread across the continent, the method traveled with them. And when West African enslaved cooks were forced into the plantation pits of the American South through the 1700s, they didn't just follow orders. They brought their own spice instincts, their own fire intuition, their own centuries of smoke knowledge, and they transformed a technique into an art form that America would spend the next 200 years claiming as its own. The smoke traveled across 2 continents before it ever touched Georgia soil. The names changed at every border crossing. The credit never once traveled with the smoke. What those enslaved cooks built inside those plantation pits, the low and slow philosophy, the fat rendering, the bark formation, the pit management, is the foundation of every BBQ restaurant you've ever walked into. The technique was Taíno. The seasoning soul was West African. The mythology was retrofitted as American, somewhere along the way when no one was looking. Every rack of ribs is a monument to the people history forgot to name. Picture it on a July afternoon, steam curling off a cart on the corner of any city block in America that has ever hosted a summer. That glistening snap when teeth break the casing, the sound alone triggers something Pavlovian. Mustard cutting clean through the fat, the bun soft enough to be almost invisible, there only to keep your hands clean. Hot dogs are baseball. Hot dogs are fireworks. Hot dogs are the most patriotic food that exists in the American imagination, but the hot dog was never born on American soil. Johann Georg Lohner, a butcher from Frankfurt, Germany, had been refining the long, thin smoked sausage he called a Frankfurter in the early 1800s, and Viennese street vendors were already selling a nearly identical version in Vienna by 1860. What crossed the Atlantic was not an American idea, but a German immigrant named Charles Feltman, who arrived at Coney Island in Brooklyn, and in 1867 began serving the sausage inside a bun so customers could eat it standing up without burning their hands. Feltman didn't sell a few hot dogs, he built an empire. His Coney Island restaurant eventually seated 8,000 people and fed hundreds of thousands of visitors every season. One of the largest restaurants in the world. Then his own employee, Nathan Handwerker, who worked for Feltman for years, left, opened Nathan's Famous, and cut the price in half. Nathan's became the legend. Feltman became a footnote. The dish kept its new Coney Island mythology. The country that made the sausage never received a single line of credit. Handwerker is on the plaque. Feltman is not the man who invented it became the footnote. The man who cheapened it became the icon. You know that smell. You've walked into a kitchen and known, immediately without being told what was in the oven. Cinnamon and butter doing something together that should probably be illegal. A crust shattering into golden shards at the touch of a fork, filling that pools and steams like it took the entire apple season to earn. There is a phrase so famous, so deeply embedded in American self-mythology that politicians have deployed it for 100 years without irony. As American as apple pie. Most people take this completely literally. Apple pie, born in America's heartland, belonging nowhere else, the edible flag. But apple pie is not American, and the apples, for that matter, aren't either. The first recorded apple pie recipe dates to 1381, written in England, referenced by Geoffrey Chaucer, baked in a pastry coffin with figs, raisins, and pears alongside the apple. The apples themselves trace back even further, to the Tian Shan mountain range in modern Kazakhstan, carried west by Silk Road traders across Central Asia and into Europe over centuries before Columbus existed. English settlers carried their pie tradition into the American colonies as immigrant food. Nothing more, nothing particularly symbolic. For most of early American history, apple pie was simply what English people ate, transplanted. What made it American was a wartime PR campaign. World War II soldiers, asked by journalists why they were fighting, began saying they were fighting for mom and apple pie, a phrase that became propaganda, then became mythology, then became so embedded in the national story that the actual origin of the dish became irrelevant by comparison. The apple came from Kazakhstan, the recipe came from medieval England, the pie came over on colonial ships. The mythology was assembled on a battlefield in Europe by American boys who were homesick and needed something to name. The one American original in this story was the story sometimes a nation doesn't inherit a dish. It inherits the story it tells about the dish. You hear it before you taste it, that violent, glorious crack when the crust gives way. A sound so specific and satisfying it should have its own word. Grease-heavy steam rising instantly, the impossible, shatteringly crisp shell yielding to something yielding, and salt deep underneath. Fried chicken is not just food in the American South, it is identity. It is Sunday. It is the dish that every other country on earth associates without hesitation, with America specifically. But fried chicken's real inventors were never American. Scottish immigrants, documented in Scottish cookbooks through the 1700s, carried their tradition of frying chicken pieces directly in fat, a technique entirely absent from English cooking of the same period, where poultry was roasted. That tradition crossed the Atlantic with Scottish settlers into the American South. Simultaneously, West African enslaved cooks brought from the continent beginning in the 1600s contributed something the Scottish tradition entirely lacked: the spice profiles, the seasoning philosophies, the cultural understanding that transformed frying from a cooking method into an art form with a soul. Both traditions met inside southern plantation kitchens. And the people who built the actual dish, who developed the brines, the dredges, the seasoning ratios, the frying temperatures that define southern fried chicken, were overwhelmingly enslaved black women cooking under conditions no recipe card will ever be able to fully describe. They built the dish. They built every technique that would eventually travel through Colonel Harlan Sanders' roadside restaurant in Corbin, Kentucky, into a red and white bucket that conquered 150 countries. The colonels signed the agreements. The women who built the foundational recipe were never asked to sign anything. The dish became American. The people who built it were never once made to feel like they were. Cold romaine, tangled in something rich and deeply funky. A dressing that coats every leaf like it's been keeping a very specific secret. The crouton's resistance, the sharp salt hit of aged Parmesan cutting through the fat of the egg. A squeeze of lemon that lifts the whole thing into something that feels refined. European, ancient Caesar salad reads as Italian in its bones. Or at minimum, as a classic of New York fine dining. Born at some white tablecloth Manhattan institution, where waiters toss it tableside for theater. But Caesar salad was invented in Mexico by an Italian on a holiday weekend when he was nearly out of food. Cesar Cardini, Italian-born restaurateur, naturalized American citizen, ran a restaurant in Tijuana, Mexico to serve American tourists during Prohibition, when American borders turned American appetites loose on Mexican hospitality. On July 4, 1924, an unexpected holiday rush descended on Hotel Caesar and stripped the kitchen nearly bare. Cardini had romaine, eggs, olive oil, Worcestershire sauce, lemon, and Parmesan. He had no other options. He tossed it tableside for theater because theater disguises desperation, and those American tourists who had crossed the border specifically because their own country had banned pleasure carried the recipe home with them. Decades passed. The salad became a fixture of American restaurant menus. It became a classic. Tijuana received no credit. Cardini's name barely survived the century long enough to appear in encyclopedia entries. The dish that was improvised from panic became the salad that American culture claimed as its own refined invention. The world's most elegant salad was cobbled together from panic, which means every great creation begins with running out of options. And here's where this story gets interesting. That heat detonates on your lips before the wing even fully lands on the table. Cayenne and butter doing something together that is genuinely dangerous. Vinegar cutting through the richness, that sticky pull of sauce on fingers you absolutely cannot stop licking. Buffalo wings hit different. They always have, and unlike almost everything else on this list, most people outside the United States assume they must be another borrowed, cobbled-together dish, the same as everything else. Another American mythology built on someone else's original. But buffalo wings are actually genuinely, irrefutably American, and the birth date is documented to the hour. October 3, 1964, the Anchor Bar, Buffalo, New York. Teresa Bellissimo received a late-night delivery of chicken wings, the cheapest, least desirable cut on any bird intended for stock. Her son Dominic arrived with his friends, hungry and broke. She deep-fried the wings, tossed them in a sauce she built from cayenne pepper and melted butter, and served them with blue cheese and celery because that was what she had. Her son's friends loved them. Word spread the length of Buffalo by morning. For decades before that night, chicken wings were considered near worthless trim. Butchers sold them cheaply or gave them away. Teresa Bellissimo took a throwaway cut that nobody wanted and turned it into the most ordered bar food on earth. 1.4 billion buffalo wings consumed on Super Bowl Sunday alone, every single year. The Anchor Bar still operates on Main Street in Buffalo. The table where it happened still exists. A plaque marks the spot. This is one of the rare documented, uncontested moments in food history where America created something entirely new and can prove it, down to the city block and the calendar day. Sometimes the things you actually invented are the hardest to believe, because real creation always looks accidental from the outside. A glossy, lacquered bun catching afternoon light in a way that makes it look almost designed. Beef juice running down a wrist before the first bite even fully lands. That smell, caramelized, urgent, impossible to walk past, rising off a flat-top grill in a way that bypasses rational thought entirely. The hamburger is not just America's most famous food, it is the most exported object in American culinary history, present on every continent, in every income bracket, in every culture that has ever intersected with American influence. But the hamburger arrived in America already named after a German city, the Hamburg steak. Raw or lightly cooked minced beef, seasoned and formed, was a fixture of Hamburg, Germany's port dining culture by the early 1800s, developed for sailors and workers who needed fast, filling protein. German immigrants flooding American ports in the 1840s and 1850s brought it with them as a dietary staple. Multiple American county fair operators, Charlie Negreen in Wisconsin in 1885, the Menches brothers at the same fair, separately claimed to have first placed the patty on a bun, which remains an unresolved historical argument America has been having for 140 years. Hamburg was one of the busiest emigration ports in the world through the mid-1800s. The people who left through that port carried their food because food is the thing that survives the crossing when everything else is left behind. American fast food absorbed the Hamburg steak, standardized it, shrank it, wrapped it in a sesame bun, slid it through a drive-through window, and exported it back to the entire world as a pure American original. Germany watched this happen. Germany said nothing. The name of the original city was right there in the name of the food the entire time. The hamburger didn't become American by accident. It became American because America was the only place that knew how to sell it back to everyone else. A paper-thin shell, impossibly crisp, that shatters in your palm with the specific sound of something fragile and secret. A small white slip folded inside, a fortune, a message, a prediction that was never actually yours to keep. Fortune cookies arrive at the end of every Chinese restaurant meal across the Western world, as an established ritual of Chinese dining culture, as indistinguishable from China as chopsticks and tea. But fortune cookies were never Chinese. They were Japanese. Makoto Hagiwara, a Japanese landscape architect living in San Francisco, served fortune cookies modeled on a traditional Japanese confection called Sugiura Senbei at the Japanese Tea Garden inside Golden Gate Park in the 1890s. The Benkyoto Company, a Japanese-owned San Francisco bakery, was producing them commercially for Japanese-American businesses by the early 1900s. The cookie was Japanese in origin, Japanese in production, Japanese in distribution, and then 1942 arrived. When Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps during World War II, their businesses shuttered overnight. Their bakeries went dark. Chinese American bakers stepped in and absorbed fortune cookie production entirely because someone had to. Because the market existed, because wartime economies do not pause for injustice. By the time the war ended and internment ended, the fortune cookie had been so completely absorbed into Chinese-American restaurant culture that its Japanese origin had become functionally invisible. A wartime injustice rewrote food history. No correction was ever issued. The silence calcified into assumption, and the assumption became the new truth taught to every child who ever cracked one open after a plate of lo mein. Sometimes history doesn't lie on purpose, it just forgets to correct itself, and the silence becomes the new truth. Molten cheese pooling into every chip crevice before the plate even reaches your table. The structural collapse of a fully loaded order happening in real time. Jalapeno heat building slowly, then detonating at the exact back of your throat where you weren't ready for it. Nachos feel ancient, they feel like they crossed the border alongside salsa and guacamole. thousands of years of Mexican tradition arriving fully formed. Most people assume nachos are exactly that, ancient Mexican street food, organic and inevitable, but nachos are younger than television. They were born from desperation, not tradition. Ignacio Anaya Garcia, known to everyone who knew him as Nacho, worked as the maitre d' at the Victory Club restaurant in Piedras Negras, Mexico in 1943. One evening after closing time, a group of American military wives arrived from the nearby Eagle Pass Army Airfield Base, with an entirely empty kitchen standing between them and dinner. Anaya had tortilla chips, processed cheese, and jalapenos. He built the plate in minutes, named it after himself, and sent it out. The women loved it. They carried the recipe back to the base. It spread through Texas military communities across the late 1940s and into the 1950s. In 1977, nachos reached a professional sports stadium for the first time in Arlington, Texas. A year later, Howard Cosell broadcast a plate of nachos to a national television audience during a Dallas Cowboys game. And what had been a regional bar food became overnight a continental obsession. America didn't take nachos, it amplified them, industrialized them, buried them in quantities of processed cheese Anaya never imagined, and then forgot to mention where the amplifier came from. His name disappeared, the dish kept the nickname. The greatest dishes were never planned. They were improvised by someone with no other choice, for guests who had no other option. Sugar sticky fingers, a glaze that hardens just enough to crack on the first bite, releasing something beneath it that is pillowy and yielding and warm in a way that is genuinely difficult to argue with at any hour of the morning. The donut, glazed, frosted, sprinkled, filled, is the architecture of the American morning. Dunkin', Krispy Kreme, the polystyrene box in the conference room. The donut is so deeply American that every other country that has a donut culture understands it arrived from America, but the donut sailed to America from the Netherlands in the 1600s in the hold of a Dutch colonial ship, inside the memory of every settler who remembered what oliekoeks tasted like. Dutch settlers arriving in New Amsterdam, the colony that would eventually become New York City, brought their oliekoeks, meaning literally oil cakes, dense balls of sweetened dough fried in pork fat, a staple of Dutch winter cooking. They cooked them over open fires in the new colony because the recipe required nothing that couldn't survive a transatlantic crossing. The ring shape, the defining feature of the modern donut, is attributed to American sailor Hanson Gregory, who claimed in 1847 to have punched the center out of his dough ball so it would cook evenly all the way through without burning the outside while leaving the middle raw. The Dutch brought the concept "America punched a hole in it" literally and then franchised the resulting shape into a global morning ritual. Dunkin' Donuts reached 46 countries. Krispy Kreme reached 35. The glazed ring that conquered the global breakfast table descended from a Dutch oil cake cooked over a colonial New York fire by settlers who just needed something sweet to eat in a new and uncertain world. America didn't invent the donut, it invented the whole. And somehow, as it turns out, the whole was enough to own the whole thing. Sometimes you don't need to invent the idea, you just need to remove the part that wasn't working and call the rest yours. 10 dishes, 10 stories. 10 moments where the world's most powerful food culture looked at something on a plate, told itself a very comfortable lie about where it came from, and repeated that lie loudly enough and long enough that it became the only version anyone ever taught their children. But here's the truth buried under every single item you just watched, and it is stranger and more complicated than theft. America didn't steal food. It did what every empire does. It absorbed the world's greatest cooking, gave it a new name, scaled it to an impossible volume, and exported it back to the planet as a universal language that crossed every border the food originally came from. Taino barbacoa became the American pitmaster's religion. A Dutch oil cake became the Krispy Kreme drive-through window. A Japanese confection became the ritual ending of 1 billion Chinese restaurant meals. The dishes survived. Some of them survived because of America. Because America's scale, America's appetite, America's willingness to love a dish obsessively and feed it to everyone it knew, kept these things alive when they might otherwise have faded. That is the complicated, deeply human truth. Nobody wants to say out loud. Food has no passport. It belongs to whoever loved it hard enough to carry it forward. Those 3 questions from the beginning, every one of them is answered now. The food was always real. The technique was always real. The people who built it were always real. Only the story told around it was ever borrowed. If even one item on this list shifted something in the way you see your plate, hit that like button, because that shift is exactly what this channel exists to cause. And there are dozens more stories exactly like these waiting to be told. Which one hit hardest? Drop it in the comments, and if you've been eating any of these your whole life believing they were purely American originals, you're not alone. The myth was that convincing. The truth, as always, was more interesting.